Rome was never stranger to power, but under Emperor Caligula, cruelty became a weapon. Imagine a ruler who turned punishment into terror, where fear ruled every corner of the empire. From the streets of Rome to the halls of the elite, no one was safe from his twisted methods. In this video, we uncover the most brutal torture methods used by Caligula, the kind of horrors that made even the strongest tremble. This is not legend, not myth. These are the dark, horrifying truths of Rome's most feared emperor. As the shadow of Caligula's reign stretched across Rome, the city itself became a stage for terror. What had once been straightforward forms of justice, fines, exile, or imprisonment, transformed under his hand into something far darker. To understand the magnitude of Caligula's cruelty, one must grasp the way he perceived punishment. To him, it was not merely a method of correcting behavior, but a tool to assert dominance, instill fear, and showcase the absolute power of the emperor. Historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe Caligula's early days as relatively ordinary, even promising. Rome had glimpsed a young leader who could embody the grandeur of the empire, but as he consolidated power, a shift occurred, one that blurred the line between law and terror. Punishments that once served to uphold order became performances designed to humiliate, terrorize, and break the human spirit. Caligula did not believe in mercy. Even minor infractions could provoke disproportionate and creative forms of retribution. Servants, citizens, and even senators quickly learned that what had been predictable justice was now unpredictable cruelty. Scholars suggest that part of this behavior stemmed from paranoia and a desire to prove that his authority was absolute. The emperor was not content with mere obedience. He demanded submission born of fear. Some punishments were subtly and psychologically devastating. Victims could be subjected to public humiliation, being forced to wear signs or endure ridicule in the marketplace. Caligula understood that suffering was amplified when it was witnessed, turning the community itself into an instrument of terror. Every citizen became both spectator and participant in a system designed to remind them of the emperor's omnipotence. Other punishments grew more severe as his reign progressed. Historical records indicate that punishments began to combine physical discomfort with mental torment, stretching the limits of human endurance. It was no longer enough to merely punish a transgression. The punishment had to instill a permanent mark on the psyche of both the victim and the observers. By redefining punishment, Caligula created an atmosphere where fear replaced loyalty, and cruelty became a form of governance. Every decree, every punishment, and every public spectacle sent a clear message: the emperor's power was limitless, and resistance, whether real or imagined, would be met with unimaginable consequences. Even within the palace walls, servants and attendants lived under constant threat. A minor mistake could provoke the wrath of the emperor, leading to consequences that were often disproportionate and terrifying. Suetonius recounts stories of household members punished not for crimes, but for perceived slights, demonstrating how deeply the culture of cruelty had penetrated every level of life in Rome. Caligula's psychological approach to punishment extended to subtle manipulations as well. He sometimes toyed with the hope of mercy, only to revoke it in ways that left his victims broken and disoriented. This strategy ensured that fear was never predictable, and the emperor's power remained unchallenged. By turning punishment into an instrument of personal expression, Caligula blurred the line between governance and sadistic spectacle. The emperor also experimented with punishments that were carefully calculated to instill dread in those who observed. He would orchestrate acts that combined both fear and spectacle, ensuring that every corner of Rome, from the grand forums to the quietest streets, resonated with the knowledge that no misstep would go unnoticed. Caligula's punishments became lessons, each one a chilling demonstration of the emperor's omnipotence. As the methods of punishment evolved, so too did the psychology behind them. Caligula's cruelty was not random. It was meticulously planned to maintain control. Victims were often made examples of, their suffering carefully choreographed to elicit the maximum impact on the population. This approach created a society constantly on edge, where uncertainty and terror became part of daily life. People learned that obedience was not enough. One had to anticipate the emperor's whims, a task impossible for even the most cautious citizen. The culture of fear spread beyond the streets and markets. Senators, soldiers, and nobles lived in a delicate balance of favor and terror. Caligula's punishments were reminders that status offered no immunity. Even those who held power were subject to the whims of a ruler who could turn admiration into horror with a single command. Caligula's reign shows how punishment, when divorced from justice and tethered instead to cruelty, can reshape an entire society. Fear became both a method of governance and a weapon of psychological dominance. The emperor's creativity and cruelty transformed Rome, instilling a sense of terror that lingered far longer than the physical consequences of his actions. By the end of his early reign, it was clear that Caligula had redefined the very nature of punishment. What had once been instruments of order and law became tools of oppression and psychological warfare. The streets, the forums, and even the palace corridors became spaces where fear reigned supreme. And as we move deeper into his reign, the public tortures he orchestrated would grow ever more terrifying, spectacles that turned the city of Rome itself into a theater of dread. This is how Emperor Caligula turned punishment into cruelty, a dark transformation that would haunt the memories of Rome for centuries. The seeds planted during this phase of his reign would bloom into public spectacles of torture and terror, setting the stage for horrors that were as psychological as they were physical. Every decree, every punishment, and every act of cruelty sent a message. Under Caligula, no one, citizen or noble, soldier or servant, was ever truly safe. As Chapter 1 revealed, Caligula's early reign transformed punishment into a tool of psychological terror. But his cruelty did not remain confined within the palace walls or the whispers of Rome's elite. It spilled outward, into the streets, the forums, and the public arenas, making the very city itself an instrument of fear. Under Caligula, punishment became a spectacle, a performance designed not merely to chastise a wrongdoer, but to imprint the emperor's power on the minds of every Roman citizen. To understand the horrifying nature of public punishment under Caligula, one must first imagine the city of Rome. It existed nearly 2,000 years ago. The forums were bustling with merchants, senators, and ordinary citizens, all moving under the shadow of monumental temples and imperial palaces. Life in the city was vibrant, yet precarious, for beneath the grandeur of Rome lay a world where obedience was demanded and fear was constant. Here, Caligula orchestrated his cruelest displays, ensuring that no corner of the empire would forget his power. Caligula's public punishments were meticulously staged, combining humiliation, fear, and physical suffering. Citizens were forced to witness the consequences of even minor infractions, understanding through observation that rebellion or disrespect could lead to unimaginable consequences. Unlike other emperors, whose punishments were often private or reserved for specific classes, Caligula's methods were indiscriminate and highly visible. The marketplace, the forum, and the public squares became theaters of terror. Historical accounts from Suetonius describe incidents where citizens accused of minor crimes were paraded before the public, their faults exaggerated, their suffering magnified. The purpose was not justice but spectacle. Caligula understood the psychological impact of such events. Fear multiplied when it was communal. Every scream, every act of humiliation, and every shaming ritual served to remind the population that the emperor's gaze was inescapable and his judgment final. Public torture was not only a tool of punishment, but a statement of authority. By subjecting individuals to public suffering, Caligula demonstrated that law, morality, and personal safety were subordinate to imperial will. It was a subtle yet devastating form of propaganda. Even those not directly punished internalized the message, living under constant anticipation of the emperor's next act of cruelty. the people of Rome learned that loyalty was insufficient. Survival demanded constant vigilance and submission. Caligula also exploited the ceremonial aspects of Roman culture, integrating punishment into festivals, games, and gatherings to maximize its effect. Citizens came to entertain themselves at gladiatorial games, unaware that alongside the sport, Caligula could stage acts of punishment for those accused of minor offenses or political dissent. By linking entertainment and terror, the emperor created a society where fear became normalized and cruelty was woven into the fabric of daily life. The public nature of these punishments amplified their psychological impact. Victims were often stripped of dignity, forced to kneel or crawl before crowds, and subjected to verbal humiliation that scarred their pride and identity. In some cases, punishments were drawn out, prolonging suffering to intensify the sense of helplessness. The aim was not merely to correct behavior, but to demonstrate that resistance or disobedience was futile. Even the architecture of Rome seemed to serve this terrifying purpose. Public squares, elevated platforms, and stages became tools in the emperor's arsenal. Punishments were carefully arranged to ensure maximum visibility, with spectators positioned to witness every detail. The emperor's agents enforced strict control over the audience, making sure that fear was contagious, spreading through whispers, gasps, and the very sight of suffering. Caligula's strategy also extended to the elite, for the lessons of public punishment were not reserved for commoners alone. Senators, wealthy merchants, and influential families were often summoned to witness the suffering of others, ensuring that even those of high status internalized the emperor's power. Fear became a currency in the empire, flowing from the top down and permeating every stratum of society. Some historians suggest that Caligula's obsession with public displays of punishment stemmed from a desire to rewrite social norms. Rome, with its long history of civic pride and citizen participation, was suddenly under the grip of a ruler who equated obedience with survival. Every public punishment was a demonstration that law and tradition were secondary to imperial whim. In this way, Caligula created a culture of terror that was both pervasive and insidious. The psychological consequences were immense. Families of victims were left traumatized. Witnesses carried the memory of each act of cruelty, and the collective consciousness of Rome was reshaped by constant exposure to fear. Public punishment became a language of power, spoken through humiliation, suffering, and spectacle, and Caligula was its master, orchestrating each performance with precision and cruelty. Even seemingly minor events were transformed into lessons in fear. A citizen who spoke out of turn, a merchant who challenged imperial taxes, or a servant who erred in the palace could all become unwilling participants in a display of terror. The unpredictability of these punishments kept the population on edge, ensuring that the emperor's authority remained unquestioned. In addition to physical and psychological punishment, Caligula often added elements of theatricality. Victims were forced to endure rituals designed to shame them before the eyes of the public. They were sometimes paraded in ceremonial garb that mocked their status, made to recite statements of guilt, or placed in positions that symbolized subservience. The public nature of these acts ensured that the memory of punishment persisted long after the event itself. Caligula's reign demonstrates how public torture can serve multiple purposes, maintaining control, instilling fear, and reinforcing the dominance of a ruler. Through spectacle and visibility, the emperor transformed ordinary civic spaces into arenas of dread. Rome's citizens learned that to live under Caligula was to witness cruelty daily, and to survive required not courage or cunning, but submission. Even as we recount these horrors, it is important to note that historical sources often present these events with dramatic emphasis. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and other chroniclers sought to illustrate the extremes of imperial power. Yet, when pieced together, a clear picture emerges. Under Caligula, public punishment was a deliberate, systematic, and terrifying instrument of governance. This chapter of his reign laid the groundwork for even more extreme measures. Public tortures were only the beginning, for as Caligula's obsession with cruelty grew, so did the intensity and complexity of his punishments. The streets of Rome became theatres of fear, where the emperor's whims dictated life and death, humiliation and despair. Citizens understood that observation alone could determine survival, and that resistance, even imagined, would be met with a display designed to haunt memory for a lifetime. As we prepare to move into the next chapter, it becomes evident that Caligula's methods were not random acts of cruelty. They were deliberate, strategic, and deeply psychological. The public tortures, the spectacles, and the manipulations of fear all served a single purpose: to consolidate absolute power, ensuring that Rome's citizens, elite and commoner alike, lived in constant anticipation of the emperor's next move. Rome had become a city where the line between justice and terror no longer existed. In every square, along every road, in every public forum, the presence of fear reminded all who lived there that under Caligula, obedience was mandatory and survival depended on submission. And as his reign continued, these lessons would only grow darker, more intricate, and more horrifying, setting the stage for punishments that were not only visible but unforgettable. As we move beyond the public spectacles of fear that define the streets of Rome, the reign of Caligula reveals an even more insidious layer of cruelty. While public punishment sought to terrify and humiliate the masses, the emperor's methods of slow, prolonged punishment targeted individuals in ways that were deeply personal, meticulously calculated, and psychologically devastating. These were not mere displays of authority, they were deliberate exercises in dominance, designed to break both body and spirit over time. Caligula's obsession with power extended into every corner of Roman life, and nowhere was this more apparent than in his approach to prolonged punishments. Unlike quick retributions, which could shock and frighten, slow punishments instilled a constant sense of dread. Citizens and servants alike lived under the knowledge that one misstep could lead to days, weeks, or even months of suffering. The unpredictability of these punishments created a constant psychological strain, ensuring that obedience was maintained not through loyalty, but through relentless terror. Historical sources, including Suetonius, describe instances where minor offences became the pretext for extreme, drawn-out punishments. Caligula understood that the anticipation of pain could be as crippling as the act itself. Victims were often made to wait, their fates uncertain, while the emperor deliberated over the severity of their penalty. This prolonged uncertainty heightened the psychological torment, leaving the accused in a state of constant anxiety and helplessness. In some cases, the punishments were as strategic as they were cruel. Caligula would combine physical discomfort with mental manipulation, turning the punishment into a lesson only for the victim, but for any observers who might hear of the sentence. The emperor's cruelty was not random. It was carefully designed to reinforce his image as a ruler whose power was absolute, whose rule was unquestionable, and whose vengeance was inevitable. The palace itself became a place of subtle horrors. Servants, attendants, and even close advisors could be subjected to punishments that were drawn out over time. Minor errors might result in extended periods of isolation, public embarrassment, or forced labor, all while being under the constant gaze of those charged with reporting back to the emperor. Every action was monitored, every mistake noted, and every opportunity seized to remind individuals that defiance, even imagined, could result in slow and agonizing repercussions. Caligula also experimented with methods that blurred the line between punishment and psychological manipulation. Some victims were placed in positions where hope was briefly offered, only to be revoked, leaving them in a heightened state of emotional distress. This deliberate alternation between expectation and despair created a profound sense of helplessness, a constant reminder of the emperor's control over life itself. Even more disturbing, Caligula's prolonged punishments were often personalized. Nobles, soldiers, and common citizens alike experienced suffering tailored to their perceived weaknesses, fears, or social standing. The emperor's keen understanding of human psychology allowed him to maximize the impact of each act, ensuring that the victim's body and mind were tested in ways that left lasting trauma. It was not enough to punish the physical body. The mind, the dignity, and the very essence of the individual had to be broken. The impact of these slow punishments extended far beyond the victims themselves. Families, friends, and colleagues watched in horror as loved ones endured humiliation and suffering. Word of these punishments spread across Rome, creating an atmosphere in which fear permeated every social interaction. Obedience became an act of survival, and every Roman citizen internalized the lesson that the emperor's reach was limitless. Historians note that Caligula's approach to punishment was a reflection of both personal cruelty and political strategy. By targeting individuals over extended periods, he demonstrated that even subtle resistance or perceived disloyalty would not go unnoticed. The anticipation, prolongation, and unpredictability of these punishments ensured that the emperor's authority remained unchallenged, while the social fabric of Rome became increasingly dominated by fear. Accounts suggest that even minor social infractions or political missteps could escalate into protracted suffering. Citizens might be confined, forced to perform menial labor, or subjected to humiliating rituals for weeks on end. In some cases, punishment included enforced public visibility, where victims were paraded or exposed while enduring their torment, magnifying the psychological and social consequences. The slow nature of these punishments ensured that fear persisted long after the act itself, embedding a permanent sense of insecurity into Roman life. Caligula's cruelty extended to the very architecture and daily operations of Rome. Courtyards, public squares, and palace chambers became instruments of control, where victims could be isolated, observed, and tormented without interference. The emperor's agents were meticulous in enforcing these punishments, ensuring that every act served as a reminder of his absolute power. Witnesses internalized the lessons of obedience and terror, while victims became symbols of what could befall anyone who challenged or displeased the emperor. Psychologically, slow punishments were devastating. They destabilized the sense of safety, trust, and routine that defined daily life in Rome. No one could be certain of when or how punishment might arrive, or how long it would last. This uncertainty was a deliberate tactic, ensuring that fear was constant and pervasive. It was a reign of terror, not only through action, but also through anticipation, a system in which the mere thought of imperial wrath could immobilize even the strongest minds. Even within the elite circles of Rome, slow punishments had their place. Senators, generals, and wealthy citizens learned quickly that status was no protection. Caligula's meticulous approach ensured that punishments were both memorable and exemplary, a warning that power and privilege offered no immunity. The combination of public visibility, psychological manipulation, and prolonged suffering ensured that the emperor's reach was felt at all levels of society. These methods were not random. They were a calculated extension of Caligula's philosophy of terror. By inflicting suffering gradually, he amplified its psychological effect, turning punishment into a multidimensional instrument of control. Every day became a potential test of loyalty, endurance, and obedience, while the emperor maintained absolute dominion over the city and its people. Through slow, prolonged punishments, Caligula solidified a culture of fear that extended from the streets of Rome to the inner chambers of the palace. Life itself became a precarious balance between service and survival. Each punishment reinforced the lesson that the emperor's rule was supreme, and that defiance, however minor, could be met with relentless, inescapable suffering. This chapter of Caligula's reign reveals the terrifying lengths to which a ruler could manipulate human behavior through deliberate, prolonged cruelty. Punishment was no longer merely a reaction to wrongdoing. It was a proactive tool, designed to maintain control, instill fear, and ensure the obedience of an entire population. As we prepare to move into the next chapter, it becomes clear that Caligula's obsession with cruelty extended even further. While public spectacles and prolonged punishments demonstrated power and instilled fear, the emperor's actions against the elite senators, generals, and nobles would reveal just how far his reign of terror truly extended. These individuals, once thought untouchable, would discover that no rank, status, or influence could protect them from the emperor's wrath. Caligula's slow and methodical cruelty laid the foundation for his most audacious acts of power and punishment, and it is this calculated, terrifying logic that makes his reign one of the most feared in Roman history. As we continue into the next chapter, we will witness the terrifying consequences faced by those who dared to challenge, offend, or simply exist under the shadow of Rome's most notorious emperor. While chapters 2 and 3 explored the terrifying public spectacles and slow, methodical punishments inflicted upon ordinary citizens, Caligula's cruelty did not discriminate. His reign of terror extended into the very heart of Rome's elite, senators, generals, wealthy merchants, and noble families alike. No position, no status, no lifetime of power could protect them from the emperor's wrath. The very people who had once held influence and commanded armies found themselves at the mercy of a ruler who delighted in demonstrating that authority was absolute, and fear was the only law that mattered. From the very beginning, Caligula viewed Rome's political elite with suspicion. He understood that senators and nobles possessed not only power, but the potential to challenge his rule. Yet rather than cultivating loyalty through respect or diplomacy, he opted for a far darker approach: intimidation, humiliation, and torture. To Caligula, the suffering of the elite was both a message and a weapon. By punishing those closest to power, he ensured that obedience extended beyond fear of death. It became a psychological and social imperative. Historical accounts describe senators being subjected to punishments that were both public and deeply personal. Their offences were sometimes trivial: a word spoken out of turn, a failure to anticipate the emperor's desires, or even the perception of disrespect could provoke Caligula's fury. Victims were often forced to endure rituals of humiliation in full view of their peers. They might be ordered to grovel before the emperor, perform demeaning acts, or confess imagined crimes, all while knowing that any misstep could result in even greater consequences. For generals and military leaders, the stakes were equally terrifying. Soldiers who had once fought valiantly for Rome could see their commanders punished for failing to please the emperor or for minor tactical errors. Caligula's interference in military affairs was not limited to command decisions. It extended to the personal lives of officers and their families. By inflicting punishment on those who once commanded armies, Caligula sent an unmistakable signal. Even Rome's protectors were not beyond reach, and their authority could be dismantled at a whim. The elite were often subjected to what historians describe as psychological tortures designed to shatter dignity and social standing. Senators might be humiliated in front of their colleagues, forced to witness the suffering of their peers, or compelled to participate in acts that undermine their honor. Wealthy citizens found their properties seized or destroyed, their reputations tarnished, and their families threatened. Through these calculated acts, Caligula demonstrated that social position offered no immunity from imperial wrath. Caligula's cruelty extended into manipulation and deception. Some nobles were granted temporary favor, only to be abruptly humiliated or punished as a demonstration to others. The unpredictability of his behavior kept the elite in a constant state of anxiety, unsure of what action might provoke the emperor's attention. This psychological uncertainty was a powerful tool. It transformed even the most confident and influential Romans into figures of fear, constantly evaluating their behavior to avoid the emperor's wrath. Even within the walls of the palace, no one was safe. Attendants, advisors, and members of noble families were frequently drawn into intricate games of power and terror. Caligula often used these individuals as instruments to punish others, forcing them to participate in humiliating or painful acts that reinforced the culture of fear. The emperor's methods were calculated not only to punish, but also to ensure that terror permeated every level of society, creating a self-reinforcing system where fear was contagious and submission absolute. The consequences of defiance, real or imagined, were severe. Accounts suggest that some senators were exiled under harsh conditions, stripped of influence and subjected to public ridicule. Others were forced to endure prolonged periods of surveillance, restrictions on movement, or humiliating tasks designed to strip away dignity. Even minor acts of dissent could escalate into prolonged psychological torment, serving as warnings to others that the emperor's judgment was omnipresent and inescapable. Families of the elite were not spared either. Wives, children, and close relatives of those who fell out of favor often experienced indirect suffering, from social ostracization to financial ruin. This extended the reach of punishment beyond the individual, ensuring that fear permeated entire networks of influence. By targeting the elite and their families, Caligula created a culture in which every connection, every action, and every word could be monitored, judged, and punished. Caligula's fascination with control also led him to stage elaborate spectacles of humiliation specifically for the elite. Senators and generals could be placed in scenarios designed to mock their status, forced to act in ways that contradicted their dignity, or publicly corrected in exaggerated and theatrical displays. These performances served multiple purposes. They reinforced the emperor's absolute authority, reminded the population of his power, and ensured that even those accustomed to privilege internalized the lessons of fear. The psychological impact of these methods was profound. Nobles who once wielded influence over Rome's policies and armies found themselves rendered powerless, constantly negotiating survival under a ruler who could destroy them with a single command. The elite learned to mask their thoughts, to anticipate the emperor's moods, and to obey not out of respect, but out of fear for their lives and the well-being of their families. Caligula's treatment of the elite reveals a chilling truth. Absolute power, when unchecked, transforms fear into governance. By targeting those who held Rome's most influence and prestige, he ensured that obedience was maintained at all levels, creating a society in which survival depended entirely on submission. The emperor's cruelty was methodical, calculated, and psychologically devastating, shaping not only the behavior of his victims, but also the very culture of the empire. The lessons of Chapter 4 are clear. No one in Rome, regardless of power, wealth, or status, was immune to the emperor's wrath. Caligula's reign of terror extended from the streets to the Senate, from common citizens to the most influential families. Through humiliation, psychological torment, and strategic manipulation, he demonstrated that fear was the ultimate instrument of control, and that loyalty was a fragile illusion when confronted with absolute authority. As the stories of the elite unfold, it becomes evident that Caligula's methods were not impulsive acts of cruelty. They were carefully designed systems of domination. Every public humiliation, every drawn-out punishment, and every act of psychological manipulation contributed to a culture where terror reigned supreme. The emperor's obsession with control extended beyond individuals to the very structure of Roman society, ensuring that no one dared to challenge him, and that every citizen understood the consequences of disobedience. This chapter sets the stage for the final phase of Caligula's reign, where fear became a force not only for control, but ultimately for the unraveling of his own rule. In the next chapter, we will explore how a life governed by cruelty, paranoia, and terror ultimately led to the collapse of his reign and the emperor's violent end. The same fear that allowed him to dominate Rome would eventually contribute to his downfall, proving that even the most terrifying ruler cannot escape the consequences of a life built on fear. By the time Caligula's reign had reached its full force, Rome was no longer merely an empire of laws, trade, and politics. It had become a city dominated by fear, where every citizen, noble, and soldier moved under the shadow of an emperor whose cruelty knew no bounds. The reign that began with seemingly ordinary punishments had evolved into a systematic, relentless, and terrifying regime. Fear was no longer just a tool, it was the foundation of governance. Caligula's obsession with control extended into every facet of life. Every public act, every decree, every punishment was calculated to remind Rome that resistance, hesitation, or even imagined disobedience would be met with consequences that were unpredictable, humiliating, and severe. The streets, the forums, the palaces, and even private homes became stages on which the emperor demonstrated his absolute power. No place was safe, no person beyond the reach of his wrath. The emperor's methods had created a society perpetually on edge. Citizens walked cautiously through the city, observing the reactions of their neighbors, weighing every word, gesture, and decision. The memory of punishments, public, slow, or directed at the elite, lingered in minds like shadows that could strike at any moment. Fear became the invisible law that guided behavior, and obedience was no longer voluntary, it was survival. Caligula's paranoia only intensified this climate. He grew increasingly suspicious of those around him, seeing plots and conspiracies in every whisper and glance. Senators, generals, and palace attendants were watched constantly. Even minor slights, real or imagined, could provoke retribution. This environment of constant surveillance and terror extended the reach of punishment beyond the visible. It became psychological, emotional, and inescapable. The emperor's indulgence in cruelty became notorious across the empire. Historical sources describe how even those at the highest levels of power trembled at the mere thought of displeasing him. Senators were afraid to speak, generals hesitant to act, and citizens fearful to express themselves. Obedience was not rewarded with respect, but the absence of immediate suffering, creating a society where anxiety and anticipation were as powerful as any physical punishment. Caligula's reign demonstrates the destructive nature of absolute power unchecked by law or morality. While earlier chapters detailed the instruments of his terror, public torture, slow punishments, and elite humiliation, this final stage of his rule illustrates how fear itself became both weapon and prison. Rome's governance relied entirely on coercion, and the emperor's authority was maintained through terror rather than loyalty. Even as his reign extended, cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed edifice of fear. The very methods that had solidified his dominance also sowed the seeds of instability. Senators, generals, and even palace officials began to plot in secrecy, aware that the emperor's cruelty, unchecked, could not endure indefinitely. Paranoia, constant surveillance, and the arbitrary execution of fear left the political system brittle, with no room for negotiation, compromise, or stability. Caligula's erratic and brutal behavior alienated those closest to him. Allies were driven away, loyalty was replaced by apprehension, and every decision made by the emperor deepened the distrust within his administration. Historical accounts suggest that he sometimes forced his inner circle to participate in humiliating acts, creating a culture where fear of personal ruin outweighed any sense of duty or camaraderie. The tools that had made him feared, psychological terror, public punishment, and manipulation, now threatened his own survival. The culmination of his reign reveals a stark truth. When power is maintained solely through fear, it is always precarious. The same terror that had allowed Caligula to dominate the empire also created enemies in every corner. Senators and guards, officials and servants, all began to recognize that survival depended on ending the emperor's reign. The structures of Rome, which had endured for centuries, were ill-equipped to contain the chaos generated by such unpredictable cruelty. According to historians, the assassination of Caligula in 41 CE was not sudden, but the result of a long-brewing conspiracy. Those closest to him, including members of the Praetorian Guard, recognized that the only way to restore stability and perhaps their own safety was to remove the emperor entirely. The brutality that had been used to maintain control became a catalyst for his downfall. The same fear that had dominated Rome now turned against him. Caligula's death illustrates the paradox of ruling through terror. It commands obedience, but only temporarily. Fear may bend wills, silence dissent, and enforce compliance, but it cannot cultivate loyalty, respect, or stability. In the end, it isolates the ruler, creating enemies where once there were subjects, and undermining the very authority it seeks to reinforce. The reign that had dominated Rome through horror and intimidation ended violently, a testament to the unsustainable nature of power rooted in cruelty. The consequences of his reign extended beyond the emperor's life. Rome's citizens, senators, and generals carried the psychological scars of prolonged terror, humiliation, and unpredictability. Families affected by his punishments remembered the suffering, and the city itself bore witness to the fragility of governance when built on fear rather than law and justice. Caligula's methods left a cultural imprint, a warning of the dangers posed by absolute power wielded without restraint. Even in death, the legacy of terror lingered. The stories of his cruelty were preserved by historians, like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, passed down through generations as cautionary tales of the extremes of human behavior when unrestrained authority meets personal obsession with dominance. From public spectacle to the slow psychological torment of individuals to the subjugation of the elite, every facet of Caligula's rule serves as a chilling lesson in the consequences of governing through fear alone. In the final analysis, Caligula's reign demonstrates the complex interplay between power, cruelty, and psychology. It reveals how fear can be weaponized to dominate a society, yet also how the very instruments of terror can ultimately undermine the wielder. The emperor's downfall was not merely a political event, it was the inevitable outcome of a system built on fear, manipulation, and relentless cruelty. Rome learned, painfully, that no empire, no matter how grand, can endure if its foundations are fear, humiliation, and oppression. The city returned to a semblance of order, but the echoes of Caligula's terror endured, a shadow over the history of the empire. Every citizen, soldier, and noble who survived carried with them the memory of a reign in which cruelty was law, punishment was art, and the human spirit was tested beyond measure. As we reflect on the life and reign of Caligula, it becomes clear that his story is both a warning and a lesson. Absolute power without restraint fosters cruelty. Cruelty without oversight breeds instability. And when fear becomes the backbone of governance, it is only a matter of time before the structure collapses. The emperor who sought to dominate Rome through terror ultimately became a victim of the very forces he had unleashed. Thus ends the reign of Caligula, a reign that began with promise, descended into horror, and concluded in violent retribution. The empire survived, but the lessons endured. Fear can command obedience, but it cannot sustain loyalty. Terror can enforce control, but it cannot prevent rebellion. And the story of Rome under Caligula remains a chilling testament to the devastating human cost of power exercised without conscience.